Hello, this is Stephanie.
And this is Brian.
Welcome to the making and the remaking of a codependent mind.
In this episode, we're going to spend some time talking about empathy.
Because empathy is a critical tool in forming and maintaining human connections.
I think it's good to think of it like that too, a tool, and not necessarily just something you have or don't have.
Before we talk too much about the role of empathy in relationships and our relationship in particular, let's just do a little bit of the what is empathy conversation.
So how would you describe it?
Well, it's kind of often been contrasted with sympathy as a way to clarify what that particular impulse is. So the sympathetic impulse being other-directed, as they say, feeling concern or feeling bad for someone that they're having a particular experience. And empathy is usually distinguished from sympathy as similarly other-directed, but in this case, you are feeling with someone. So it's a fairly complex response. It involves understanding both intellectually and emotionally someone's experience and then behaving in a way that reflects that understanding.
I think a common phrase that jumps into my head is being able to put yourself in their shoes. I hear that phrase a lot, and I think that's kind of sums up empathy.
But again, that's a very complicated act.
It is, right. And it's not the same as sympathy, where it's just a phrase I think of with that is like feeling sorry for someone.
Yeah, right. And not, it doesn't have to be in a patronizing way.
No, right.
So it's a system response. It's not just this one feeling as we're describing it. I mean, the act of putting yourself in someone else's shoes involves, as I was saying, cognition, involves emotion, involves action. So we mentioned in the book an empathetic system, which I think we might have made up.
I really like that. That was yours.
You can't really Google it, but just to try to incorporate all those three dimensions, that the empathetic system, this intellectual and emotional understanding, and then this kind of action involves parts of your cognitive system and parts of your emotional system and parts of your behavior system, your motivational system. I mean, all these systems kind of come together to enable you to have this response to another human being where you feel you are walking in their shoes.
It's really helpful for me to think of it as a system like that, because there could be, when it comes to a system, there could be one particular piece that breaks down that sort of causes the whole system to malfunction. So you may have the initial impulse of empathy or the capacity for it, but then something happens that causes the whole thing to not work properly.
And we're going to talk about that with you, because I think people with interpersonal disorders, often their empathetic system is disordered. That's part of the disorder.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's our this is what empathy is. And just to go back to its role in relationships, people talk about it playing a critical role in enabling human societies, connecting us to each other, allowing us to cooperate and to care for each other. There's a quote attributed to Margaret Mead, who is a famous anthropologist from the early 1900s. I don't know if you've heard of her.
Yeah, right, vaguely. But
sounds familiar. I mean, I think she's maybe the only famous anthropologist.
Okay.
Name an anthropologist if you can come up with Margaret Mead. But anyways, supposedly a student asked her, what's the mark of a civilization? And she said that it was finding a broken femur that had healed. The idea being that someone broke their thigh bone and someone cared for them. They didn't just leave them on the ground and go off on their merry way. So she was targeting the early point of civilization as when humans started to care for their injured and sick members of their community, which is not something that you see broadly in the animal kingdom. I mean, there's a lot of problems with that anecdote, apparently. So I mean, clear that she said that. And we do see, and they have found actually now evidence of animals caring for other animals.
Yeah, that's right. I have seen that too.
Yeah, I mean, the more advanced species.
Mm-hmm.
Like our monkey and ape cousins.
Yes.
But not like insects or...
Even kind of using medicinal, plant medicines and things like that. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah, so there's evidence of empathy in other animals as well.
Alleviating pain in others, suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which involves, again, this kind of somewhat complex response of recognizing other people's pain because you yourself feel pain. So you can understand what they might be going through and what they might need in that situation. And then you are motivated to provide that.
And knowing that the system works better when you do things that you wouldn't like that others would do for you too.
So it may be obvious. I mean, we would just be covering obvious ground that you need within a romantic relationship, an intimate relationship, there should be a level of empathy towards each other.
Yeah.
That empathy is this kind of powerful tool to stay connected, but it often goes wrong.
Right. It seems obvious, but it's actually, like you said, it's a complex system and it can break down in many ways and erode even.
And I think what we find with people with interpersonal disorders like codependency and others is that while they're certainly other focused, so it may feel to them and maybe kind of look to others like they're empathetic, it isn't really, their empathetic system isn't really functioning in an ordered way.
So this is something we touched on in the book too. It comes down to the motivations of those behaviors. So like, what is the person, say the codependent person or whatever, the interpersonally disordered person, what are they feeling exactly? What's motivating their response?
For you, for instance, let's talk about the ways in which you were other focused, but potentially not empathetic.
Yeah, right. For me, that started with motivation, right? So it started with usually fear of some kind. So I would be afraid of the consequences of someone's, say, anger or dissatisfaction. What does this mean for me? How is this person's anger going to affect me? What's going to be expected of me? What do I need to do in response to that, whether I agree with it or not?
So you were very other focused almost since childhood on what your dad was feeling, what your mom was feeling,
Yep.
what your friend G was feeling, and then that just went forward. So when you got to your romantic partners, your intimate partners, it would appear like you're being empathetic. Similar to what we talked about in the caretaking episode. So you're very other focused. You were almost hyper vigilant as to what they were feeling.
Yeah, right. For me, it wasn't necessarily, I didn't stop to think, why is this person angry? It was just like, it was kind of just more...
Or upset or distressed or sad.
Yeah, right. Anything that I felt compelled to, which my actions would be to try to soothe that person, to try to change their emotion into something positive, to make myself feel safe. More, obviously I didn't know I was doing any of this. But yeah, what it looks like is I just would get an overwhelming impulse to correct this person's emotional response. And so why they felt that was not really important. And that's the problem, right? So I'm just reacting to someone's emotion.
But you would even have pre-reactions, right?
Yes. Yeah. Preemptively.
I mean, you would just all day, every day, using what should have been your empathetic system, your cognition, your emotional reactions, your actions, were focused on managing this other person.
So I'm anticipating what they may say, what they may do, and then I'm taking action based on what I think that is.
What they may need. So it looks like perhaps empathy. You're very other focused, but really, as you said, it was because other people's distress or anger or negative emotions caused you distress. You weren't feeling with them.
No.
You needed them not to feel bad because you could not handle their bad feelings.
And so a lot of times I don't know about a lot of times, but sometimes the action taken in response could look similar, right? Because I'm trying to soothe this person. But if I have actual empathy, I may be trying to soothe the person. But it matters what that motivation is and what I'm feeling when I'm experiencing someone else's emotional distress.
Because if you're afraid of negative emotions or have difficulty managing any kind of strong emotions, whether they're negative or positive, how are you going to feel with somebody? How are you going to put yourself in their shoes? That's not a place where you can be. And so we see these reactions, whether it's a codependent reaction to try to people please and caretake, whether it's an avoidant reaction, people with avoidant attachment styles who might withdraw in the face of other people's distress, anxious attachment where it gets more expressive anxiety. I mean, and all of these things can be other focused, and it looks like they're almost hyper vigilant against the other person because it's kind of like an empathetic system overload.
Yeah, that's true. Right.
You couldn't take on anyone else's feelings because you were spending so much energy kind of managing your own. So other people's emotional responses had to be managed.
Right. And I think for me, there was always an element of powerlessness in there too, as if I wouldn't be able to do anything to help them anyway.
So yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how the different ways that the empathetic system can be overloaded and can malfunction. So I describe these different elements: a cognitive element, an emotional element, an action element.
What, really quick, would you say is the cognitive element?
Being able to have some level of understanding what the other person's experiencing.
Okay, being able to describe it, kind of like naming someone else's emotion, is like you would name your own.
Yes, exactly. Or name their suffering or their pain. So, for instance, someone's parent dies. Okay, I can understand why that's distressing, what kind of distress that might cause. So one of the challenges to your empathetic system was even that cognition piece.
I wasn't used to looking at my own situation and understanding what I was going through to begin with, because I was avoiding so many things, that when I look at someone else, it's a similar thing. I have some kind of flash judgment about that person, or like I think I know what their experience already is or what it's going to be, because of these management techniques that I have, So I'm not really, it seems harsh to say like I didn't care what they were experiencing, but it kind of effectively looks like that.
Well, that's why we're calling it an empathetic system malfunction, because you are a caring person. But right, part of it was this misunderstanding of yourself, and that everyone else is successful or everyone else is X and I'm not.
Yeah, right.
So you can't see anyone else's suffering or loneliness or distress or challenges because you're just assuming it's just you.
It seems like they have it together, so therefore they must. So I'm not even going to pay attention, really. I'm just assuming that I'm just kind of have this unique set of suffering or
Exactly, yeah. So that's one of maybe how a cognitive misfunction happened with you. And then it could misfunction on the emotional level. So even if you saw and understood someone else's distress or loneliness or vulnerability, your emotional system could still misfire.
Well, and that's also, it was for me in a huge way, a lack of understanding of my emotions too, and how they worked, and therefore how they worked for other people. I mean, that's one part of it, but then there's also the fact that, like we said, someone else's negative emotions gives me fear or gives me shame, and now I'm just focused on that. So it shuts down very quickly. It did for me. I may have a moment of like, oh, I could feel this person's emotion, I can empathize with them, and then the second that I feel implicated or it feels dangerous to me or unsafe in some way, then I'm totally on myself. I'm just into self-preservation. I'm triggered, my trauma may be triggered.
And we've talked about that experience quite a bit in the book and in the previous seasons, how your emotional capacity was always close to full. So taking in any other kind could put you in a free state, could put you in a flee state, could put you in a shame spiral.
And it's pretty upsetting to me now, being more of an empathetic person, to see that switch flip. And to be able to look back on difficult conversations we had and know when it just went away, it went out the door, and I was completely focused on what I was feeling, what I was experiencing.
But I think it's not fair to say you are now an empathetic person and you were not empathetic before, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about your system was still there, as robust as it is now. It would just get overloaded because of these past unhealed traumas that you were carrying, and that were a block to an empathetic response, including the last piece of an empathetic response. So if there's this understanding piece, this feeling piece, and then there's this acting piece. If you got through the understanding and managed to get through feeling for the other person, you could still run up against this problem of acting on your empathy.
Yeah, what happens when I get to the guard at the door at the end of all that? Can I face fear of action? Because that's something that it was very common for me too, that even, back when I really didn't understand my emotions, I would go, okay, yes, something was kind of clear to me that someone was experiencing something. It was clear to me what they were most likely feeling. I didn't necessarily feel that I needed to behave codependently, but what's going to happen if I do something? Is this other person going to get upset or something? It was very complex when it came to actually taking action.
I can literally remember interactions that we had or experiences that we had together where you would clearly get through the first two pieces. So maybe if I was hurt or angry, we would talk about it, and you would be able to intellectually understand and demonstrate to me that you understood why I was upset or angry or hurt. And you would offer me emotional support and validation for that. But then maybe there would be this period where you needed to then go off and take an action in response. Mm-hmm. And can you think of some times?
Oh yeah, no, this was.
And then what would happen?
And then I would feel too afraid to take the action. Then that fear would be followed by shame of knowing that I didn't take the action that I knew that I needed to make, or even said that I was going to make. And then that shame, since I wasn't able to sit with the shame and process the shame, I had to avoid it in my habitual ways, which often involve some kind of dishonesty, some kind of resentment, to clean it up in my mind, because I'm not going to be able to act on this. Basically, I'm coming to that conclusion.
So there's the powerlessness we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
That you can trace right back to your childhood, where you were powerless with your parents. I mean, kind of explicitly with G, you had a number of empathetic wounds, let's call it, where you were forced to watch him abuse other people. That
had as much, if not more, of an impact on me than the times he did things directly to me. Because the feeling of the powerlessness and the feeling of the shame that came from that was pretty severe. So and then I developed ways to sort that out in my head, being like what we went to a lot in the book, storytelling, narratives. So going in, severing my own emotions around it, and trying to come up with these rationalizations on why I didn't, why I couldn't, whatever it was. And back then it was usually just as simple as, well, he would have done something bad to me, so I couldn't.
Which is true.
Yeah, which is true.
So these challenges to your empathetic system became and have been challenges in our relationship pretty quickly, because it's very difficult, once you get through the early period of excitement and falling in love, etc. It's difficult to maintain that connection if both people are not attempting to understand and feel with each other. And so when we would have conflict, it would be hard to resolve, because even if you went down the empathy path, it would often be, as we described earlier, where you would go in another direction and then I'd be by myself in my distress.
Yeah. And for me, it seemed to pretty much always come down to some sort of powerlessness and shame. And the further we go back, the earlier we go back to the relationship, before I even understood my trauma and my shame and any of that stuff, that was pretty much every difficult conversation. So almost every conversation where empathy was necessary and would have been very helpful for us to move through and complete the conversation, it just got severed for me. And then these terrible behaviors come out.
So it wasn't a tool in your toolkit for maintaining a relationship. And so if people are thinking, okay, well, then how do I do this? Like, how do I move from this disordered other-centeredness to a more robust, empathetic response?
Yeah, how do you use it as a tool? So one of our earlier big examples that both of us remember of a time where I managed to behave a different way, where I managed to behave more empathetically than I did in previous similar difficult. We had an especially difficult exchange. There was a time where you had found out some information where I had behaved hurtfully. There was a betrayal of you, and you were understandably very upset.
Meaning you did that first part, you understood.
So I understood why you were upset. So got through the first one, right? Understood why you could be upset, which is kind of the second one. Like, how would I have felt? And I remember doing that. I remember thinking that at the time, like how would this make me feel? Not great. I would probably feel exactly the same. And you had gone off somewhere because I think at the time you said, I had asked where you were, and because I wanted to talk about it somehow, I didn't. And you told me where you were, and says, I don't know if it's a good idea if we get together at this moment because I'm very upset. And I'm like, well, I want to be where you are. And my impulse for that at that moment, because I can remember it very clear, it was a very harsh, embedded incident in my brain, that my motivation wasn't, I need to calm her down, I need to diffuse what you were feeling. My own motivation was, I need to be there and show you that I understand, show you that I feel what you're feeling. And I had a huge amount of shame, because I always did back then. And this was well before I understood trauma and all that stuff. It was getting close. We were just a couple of months away from starting on this whole journey. But I remember that, just feeling that shame and going, I'm going to put that on my mind. This is not about me right now in this moment. So I'm going to sit with this, and I'm going to be here for you. And I'm not going to try to say things that will diffuse it, or, just everything I was doing. It felt motivated by what you were feeling and what you were going through. So that was an early version of successfully feeling on and acting on empathy for me.
Like you said, I'd warned you. I'm upset. I'm angry. So that's what you're in for if you show up. And you showed up and you let me be upset and angry. And we were able to move forward because of that.
Yeah, it was actually a pretty pivotal point in those days because, like I said, it was a month or two before we started this whole journey because it gave us both a little hope that we didn't necessarily have the day before that because things weren't looking great as far as things we were learning about me and my behaviors. Yeah.
And then you just kind of got better at that whole process, that whole understanding, feeling with me, taking the action and feeling that you could take action.
Right. That's the other thing. Like I can survive this. So it made it easier for me to actually be there, to actually stay empathetic rather than it severing.
If we go back to those kind of three elements, one, you worked harder at the understanding.
Yes.
I think a lot of people just maybe bypass that, especially if they're just hyper focused on containing the other person's emotions somehow. Yeah. Then they don't even take a moment to, am I really understanding what they're feeling? Am I understanding what their reaction to? So not just right off the top apologizing or placating or, oh, it's my fault, right? Without really even taking the time to understand, well, what's the other person feeling? Why are they feeling upset or betrayed or depressed? They go right to, what can I do to make them stop feeling that? I'll say anything I need to say.
And there also may be elements of just like you may just be assuming what the other person is going through, even if you don't know. And because, I know this person, they always get upset when X happens or something, so therefore I don't even care. I'm not even going to inquire. I just, because I already know.
So you got better at that. I've got better as too. I'm not trying to say that it was perfect, but it was more challenging for you. So
yes.
We're just talking about that and how people can maybe move again into have a more robust empathetic toolkit. So really listening to understand, not to manage. And then the emotional block, feeling capable of feeling with the person, not turning it back on you, not getting overwhelmed with your own emotions. You got better at that, because you did start to resolve much of the shame. You did start to understand that I was going to have emotions.
Yeah, right.
That I could use your help with, but that doesn't mean that they're your responsibility.
Ian, I didn't have to go into what were kind of my two go-tos being shame spiral. This sort of, like you said, quick to apologize or quick to just like take it all on. And this is, I'm worthless. Mm-hmm. Man, I can't believe I did this. Or flip-flop that, which actually often both of these happen. That would happen first, and then I can only inhabit that so long. So then I flip it onto you in my head, like, how dare you make me feel this shame?
It's somehow my fault.
Yeah.
And then the action as well, you felt as you felt more empowered in our relationship and in your life broadly, you were better able to act, and two, also I think better able to understand what action was required, which was usually very often just say holding me or letting me feel what I was feeling.
Yes.
Listening to me, being there for me, being empathetic.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Because I can remember times the difference. Obviously, sometimes it is important to say things. I mean, if that's necessary, you need to explain something or
demonstrate understanding or.
Yeah, right. So holding on to the empathy is being able to understand what is helpful, what is needed here, like what do you need, rather than what do I think is going to be the quickest way out of this, or what's going to be the quickest way to end this conversation and put your feelings away because this is making me feel shame. This is making me afraid. Because maybe, there's likely going to be a good reason why you're feeling this. And I want to know what it is. So curiosity, back to that amazing word, is so important. And curiosity is a tool to go with the tool of empathy. So when I think about times of disagreement, or times of difficult conversation, it can be really hard. It can be hard to maintain the empathy, and it can be hard to be curious. But the curiosity should go both ways when you're having one of these. Like it becomes especially important. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling afraid? Okay, why am I feeling afraid? Oh, because I think this person's emotions are going to affect me. Okay, well, that's good to be conscious of. And then also, what are they feeling? It could be as simple as asking, you seem upset. Can you explain that? Can you describe it?
As you're describing it, empathy can be hard, for sure. And it can be overwhelming. It's not just people with interpersonal disorders that can have their empathetic system overwhelmed. I mean, we heard about, for instance, during the COVID pandemic, the earlier days, kind of feeling this empathetic overload or empathetic fatigue. I mean, just the volume of care that other people needed, or people in our lives needed, it can be overwhelming. But I think it's important that people who have struggled interpersonally allow themselves some grace and some understanding that it isn't that they're not empathetic people.
Yes, right.
It isn't one of two things, which I think maybe you can hear from people who struggle with interpersonal disorders. It isn't that they're too empathetic, right? Because often their behavior, as we're describing, isn't really empathy. It's false caretaking. It's management. It's trying to contain and control other people's emotions. And it isn't that they're not empathetic. It's not that they're narcissists. It's not that they don't care. It's that often their empathetic system can get overloaded. They do care,
Yeah.
and they care too much. And there's no room for that because of the wounds that their empathetic system has suffered. So it's really about thinking about what that empathetic system is designed to do and allowing it time to kind of heal and develop in a way that maybe it hasn't had the chance to do so yet. So now I feel we're in a pretty good place in terms of that, because without that piece, and we've had episodes on trust and vulnerability, without those pieces, it's hard to trust the other person if you don't feel that empathetic response when you express your distress. You know, when we had those times when I would express distress or anger or hurt, and there'd be this empathetic system misfire on your part. I mean, I knew that it wasn't because you didn't care about me or that you didn't love me, but gosh, it kind of felt that way.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So that was not a tenable situation long term.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of how you demonstrate what you feel for other people is in part feeling with them, being there for them and with them when they're in distress.
It's like the verb version of love. When you think about there's love, the emotion, I love this person. And then what does it mean to verb love the person?
To verb love them.
and yeah, so this lack of empathy was a misfire.
Right. It is a tool. It's the glue. It's critical daily practice in our relationship. And I think in a lot of healthy, intimate relationships.
So that's our take on empathy.
I hope we join you in a couple of weeks.